As a part of the universe, called into being by one Father, all of us are linked by unseen bonds and together form a kind of universal family, a sublime communion which fills us with a sacred, affectionate, and humble respect. Here I would like to reiterate that God has joined us so closely to the world around us that we can feel the desertification of the soil almost as a physical ailment, and the extinction of a species as a painful disfigurement. Hello, my name is Robin Ryan. I teach systematic theology at CTU, and it's a real pleasure to be with you to share a few reflections on this Laudato Si encyclical. I want to focus my attention on the theme of communion in this important letter of Pope Francis. Throughout Laudato Si, friends, Francis emphasizes the deep connection that we have with one another as human beings and with the entirety of creation. There's a bond between us that runs deeper than the differences that divide us. Early in the letter, he describes the human person as someone who is capable of self-possession and of freely giving himself or herself and entering into communion with other persons. So this capacity for communion is essential to what it means to be human. The Pope comments on the ancient stories of creation in the book of Genesis, like the creation accounts in Genesis 1-3 and the story of Cain and Abel in chapter 4. He tells us that these biblical stories bear witness to a conviction that we today share, that everything is interconnected, and that genuine care for our own lives and our relationships with nature is inseparable from fraternity, justice, and faithfulness to others. So Pope Francis is calling us to a keener awareness of our connections with our fellow human beings and with the natural world. And he stresses that one impacts the other. So on the one hand, he says that a sense of deep communion with the rest of nature cannot be real if our hearts lack tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow human beings. So ecological responsibility is inextricably connected with our responsibility toward other human beings, especially the most vulnerable in our world. And on the other hand, Francis tells us that our indifference or cruelty toward fellow creatures of this world sooner or later affects the treatment that we mete out to other human beings. Isn't that true? A personal attitude of indifference or neglect or cruelty can permeate all the relationships in a person's life. Throughout his writings and addresses, Pope Francis frequently reiterates this principle of communion in the shadow of two destructive vices that he believes plague the lives of people today: self-absorption and indifference. He even speaks of the globalization of indifference. Francis seems to connect these vices with a stance of individualism, which he thinks ultimately demeans us. He says that our openness to others, each of whom is a thou, capable of knowing, loving, and entering into dialogue, remains the source of our nobility as human persons. And he argues that if we truly wish to care for our sisters and brothers and for the natural environment, individualism must be overcome by disinterested concern for others and by the rejection of every form of self-centeredness and self-absorption. Francis teaches that the antidote to self-absorption is solidarity, which is closely linked with communion. You and I are summoned to adopt a stance of solidarity with our brothers and sisters, especially the poor and marginalized. That also includes a solidarity with the generations of people who will come after us, and thus a solidarity that's committed to sustainable development. For Francis, communion is more of a verb than it is a noun. It's something that we must do. We must practice it. In one of his general audiences in Rome, Francis said this: "It's necessary to seek to build communion, to teach communion, to get the better of misunderstandings and divisions, starting with the family, with ecclesial reality, and an ecumenical dialogue too. Our world needs unity. This is an age in which we all need unity. We need reconciliation and communion, and the Church is the home of communion." So Francis appeals to you and me to become people who build communion with others and who honor our connection, our communion with all creatures by ecological responsibility. And all of this is based on our Christian conviction that God and God's very self is communion, that the Trinity, in whose image and likeness we have been created, is a communion of life and love, of giving and receiving among three persons. Francis tells us that because the Trinity is the divine model for the created world, each of us grows more, matures more, and is sanctified more to the extent that we enter into relationships, going out from ourselves in communion with God, with others, and with all creatures. It seems to me, friends, that Francis's teaching on communion is worthy of sustained reflection. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of Catholic Theological Union. For additional videos and podcasts, or to learn more, please visit www.ctu.edu or visit learn.ctu.edu.